Welcome to Writersmelon. Hope you're having a good day.
Thank you for having me. Hope all is well where you are.
Yes, yes. So, Vikram, I'll start with your novels that you have written. You've written three novels based on Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, Hindu nationalist movements, and the anti-Sikh riots in 1984. So these are actually some of the most important events in the history of India. So do you have any ideas for more books based on these facts? I mean, why are these topics so interesting for you, and what is the kind of research that you go ahead with, as in conduct, for writing these books? So tell us more
Yeah.
about the whole journey.
Okay, it's a big mystery to me as well why I keep writing about such issues because I'm not really interested that much in politics. I don't watch the TV news all the time and all that. But I think the interest emanates from, I often think about like how did the world become this way, or how did we become the country we are?
Mm-hmm.
And times I go back and investigate that, and I think the novel comes out of that. Now, for instance, what I'm working on now, this idea came to me in 2018 in Vermont. I had a fellowship at the Vermont Studio Center in the summer of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And started thinking, so much happened in India in the 90s. There were the caste riots, the Mandal Commission caste riots. There was the Ram Mandir issue with Advani going on his Rath Yatra. There was HIV AIDS was running amok, in India at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And there was civilization. And a lot of how we live today in India was
Mm-hmm.
pretty much determined by the 90s, what came
Right,
out of the
right.
90s.
Yes.
So then, this idea I started playing around with that, maybe why not, write a novel about the 90s, which would, but because I was going to write a novel, I mean, so I would write it as the story of a fictional working class neighborhood in Delhi, a basti, and I would tell the story through the eyes of a young man coming of age.
Okay.
So actually, I did nothing more with it in 2018. I started writing it in 2019. I started working on it. And that's what I'm continue to work on novel wise. Of course, as you know, I've been interrupting it from time to time to write short stories and
Yes.
essays,
Yes.
all that, because you can't, but I found that you can't simply work on long projects,
Yes.
otherwise you get fossilized, if you do that. And also, like, I'm also a professor. So while you're teaching it's easier to work on the shorter projects, because with novels, you've got to work on them, after you've got a certain amount, like let's say 100 pages, 100, then you got to work on them regularly, because, if you put them aside for a while, it's very difficult to get into the voice, the mood, and whole thing of the novel.
Yes.
But with shorter stuff, you
Before
can.
we get more into your process, I want to know more about the story of assassination. So you said a bit about a boy in that basti where this whole
No,
80.
this is not the assassination. This is what I'm writing about
Right.
now.
Okay, okay. So tell us about assassination, Esther, and then tell us about what you're writing next. So first, tell us about assassination a little more.
Or how it came about. You
Yes,
want
how
that?
it came about. What is it? What should a reader expect from it? Uh,
Well, assassination, see, uh, when I was in school and I was very, very young at that time, I lived through the 84 anti-Sikh massacre in Delhi because I am a Delhiite, and it did affect me in, I think, not as much when I lived through it, but later on when I thought about it, because see, I came from the right community. I came from the Hindu community. So I was never going to be targeted or beaten up, or my house was never going to be burned.
right.
But things like that did, but I had Sikh friends at the time for whom that was a real possibility.
True.
And later on, I mean, like, see, so with novels, it's better to let them it's better to look back. If you're writing history, it's better to look back on lived history than write it at the moment, and then I was too young also at that time. So about many years later, as a grown man, I returned to those events in my mind, and that's how those characters then started to come together. And then also, not too much work at that time had been done on 1984. I mean, it had almost been forgotten and put aside. So that's where the idea came. And then you're writing a novel. So then the characters started coming, a Hindu family, a Sikh family, a marriage between the two, which would never have been a problem in the early 80s, in India. I mean, you knew there was a Hindu-Muslim divide in India when you were growing up. But there was no Hindu-Sikh divide in India. But after 1984, that also emerged for several years during the Khalistan movement and after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. So then all those things, came together. And then, of course, there was a little bit of research because I was writing with events that had really happened as a backdrop for the novel. So there was a little bit of
For
research.
you, the story was a combination of research and a lot from a personal lens as well. As in, because you were in that point of history, you were pretty much alive, although young, but you were present. So,
Yeah.
how much of fact or how much of fiction, and how do you like blend it together? How has been your experience writing something or fictionalizing something that you have very closely experienced or witnessed in a way? So how was that experience for you?
Well, even when you write historical fiction with facts, you got to understand at the end of the day you're writing fiction. So the fictional imperative should always win. If what could have happened is more important than what happened if you're writing fiction. In that sense. So with 1984, now I didn't now what that so my characters are all fictional, and but the conditions that they have to live through are not fictional, in that sense, because Mrs. Gandhi's assassination happened. There was a massacre that went on for 3 days in which more than 3,000 Sikhs were killed. And that particular massacre did radicalize a lot of Sikhs, young Sikhs who would never have been involved in the Khalistan movement otherwise, but, and weren't involved before. But because of that, they got radicalized. So one of my characters is exactly that kind of person. He comes from what is a very secular family, from that time, and has secular beliefs, is a cut Sikh, not a Sikh with a turban. But then what happens in the events of 1984 serves to radicalize him and push him more and more towards religion and towards the militancy, which results in a schism developing between him and the Hindu girl he loves and wants to marry, which is something, as I said, it was something that I'm sure could have happened in the events of 1984, which I built the story. So while the backdrop is fact, what's happening on the stage is all fiction.
Great. So, and then now your next book is also in that backdrop of communal tension, or is it a different period and a different backdrop?
Well, it's the 90s, like I told you. It's the 90s. Of course, the communal part comes into it because Ram Mandir, is one of the big issues, of the 90s. Some caste comes into it, as well.
Yes.
And there's also, and then HIV/AIDS comes into it because I have a major character who is gay and is scared that he might have AIDS, which was very much danger in the 90s, because India was one of the countries where AIDS was widespread, in the 90s, and society won't acknowledge that, at that particular point in time. so all those issues come into, that come into that particular novel. So while it's so I would like to think of it, it's much more of a socio-political novel compared to the other stuff I've done,
Right.
so far in the novel form, which has probably had more political overtones.
Got it.
That's it.
Got it. So very interesting, because the other day I was talking to another author who also writes a lot of historical fiction. Her name is Manpreet Sodhi, and she's writing the
Yeah.
pre-independence and the post-independence era, also about partition. And for me, it is a bit of a coincidence that I'm kind of having like a full 2 decades of story of India lying laid in front of me, because of authors like you who really take that time and energy to retell history in more interesting way for the next generations. Because I remember growing up in the 2000s and my board exams getting postponed because of the Gujarat riots, and I was actually
Yeah.
in Gujarat, living in Baroda at that time.
Mhm.
So, so it really kind of brings a lot of perspective, and it is often said that history repeats itself, and
Mhm.
unfortunately, people don't really learn from history, So, and unfortunately, it continues to repeat itself. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's really very interesting that authors like you are putting up these fictional work with lots of research, obviously, to give that backdrop of that time and era, and recreating that time and era. I would like to then ask you about your experience as an author. How has been your publishing journey? How has it been? Because this is not an easy business. I mean, very few people can
Mhm.
do this full time. How has been your experience as an author in the publishing world, getting your book published, promoting it, getting it to readers, getting the feedback, and then getting the courage to write the next one, and again doing the same, going through the same journey? How has it been your experience? How has
Well,
been your experience?
well, as far as writing is concerned, I'll just deal with the last one first. As far as writing is concerned, doesn't really require too much courage because it's an obsession. So
True, true,
you're
true.
just following something that you like doing.
Yeah.
The Now you're talking about, the publishing journey. I mean, I always say that writing is the fun part. Everything else, editing, proofreading, selling it, promoting it is work. That's pretty much it,
Yes,
at the end of the day.
absolutely.
Now, my as far as, my publishing journey is concerned, well, like I think every author, there are the good points, there are the bad points. I wish there were some things that I had done differently,
Mm.
and in some cases I wish I had read the fine print of contracts, more closely, especially in the beginning, because when you start out, you're so happy just to get published,
Yeah.
that. Don't really pay much interest to that, and I'd worked through agents before I actually started working through them, because it's their job to negotiate and read contracts and do stuff like that. As far as publishing journey is concerned, as far as my books are concerned, I've dealt only with Indian publishers,
Right.
so I mean, anyway, on the shorter stuff, I've dealt all over the world. I mean, with the short stories, the essays, just where you are. I think you're in Berlin.
Yes. Yes.
Just last month, I published an essay in the Berlin Quarterly.
Oh,
You
really?
know,
Okay. So
so
you
that
find
was
these
just.
shorter pieces easier, and this. So what has been your experience in terms of writing longer pieces? Like you mentioned that it is obviously easier to deal with the shorter pieces, and it's faster to get it out. So has your experience been more smoother in getting these literary pieces out in literary magazines and things like that?
No, it's like, I know, like I said, while teaching, they're easier to write during the semester
Yeah.
because they take less time, they have less bulk in them. After you've written 100 pages, you have to be fairly regular, because if you put it aside for 2 months, you forget everything, and then you got to get back in, which takes time. but something that's 20 pages long, 15 pages long, it's much easier to get back into it, while teaching. It's easier to write the longer pieces during the vacations, like the summer
Yes.
vacation or the winter break, or, stuff like that. So that's been there. But, as far as getting them out is that the West, and parts of Asia, they have they have many more literary magazines,
True.
and certainly many more paying gigs, in literary magazines, and also with due respect to Indian editors, who I'm sure do a very good job, but the editors that I have found in the West, have been maybe because they have there's more time or more money or whatever, but they're very they take they it's been a joy working with most of them, and they've done everything that they possibly can to get it, to the best that they possibly can. So that's been the one difference, in that sense. Like, even in India, I worked with some really good editors, but then I've also worked with some very indifferent editors, in that. So it's been a mixed package.
Understood. And you said that there is a dearth of literary journals or opportunities to publish shorter literary pieces in India. But do you still have, because I haven't heard probably even a single literary journal in India, do you still have some options for writers who are writing short stories to get
Yeah,
published in literary magazines?
yeah, I did publish one story last year with the Punch
Punch,
magazine.
okay.
In October of 2020. It was a story about a couple dealing with a miscarriage, which came out in them. And they did a okay job, with. But you're right, as far as short fiction is concerned, I have published just about everything outside India, whether it's in Britain or in America, or, Mekong Review is in Australia, and then Hong Kong Review in China, and so everything I've published has been outside, India, in that sense. I'm sure. So there is one, I think there's also Muse India, which is another one, and but but they tend to be almost exclusively digital
Yes.
magazines. I mean, and none of them has a print, sort of run in that sense. So it's all online publishing, and I don't know. I think maybe the Bombay Review pays. I don't know about the rest, but maybe they pay a little bit, but none of the others pay, while in the West you find many more paying gigs, for short work. In India, yeah, then I publish a lot of non-fiction in India with the Hindu and Frontline and all that. That's a different matter altogether. I mean, you do get a small check for them, in that sense, but then that's going more towards journalism and
Correct,
nonfiction.
correct,
You know.
correct.
Yes.
So then, what about the readers? How would you think the evolution of the readers has been in India in the last probably a decade? Do you see, for example, do you see more of digital content being consumed as compared to paperback, hardcover books? Do you see people reading more books in general? Because that's a question that I always try to answer or try to solve. So,
Yeah.
what do you think about the readers and how they
Well,
evolved in India?
India is a mixed bag. Like, you see, during the pandemic, in I think 2020 was the last figures. I mean, and actually the sales of books, adult books, I'm talking about, not just not children
Commercial
book,
fiction, commercial.
but even the adult fiction, literary and commercial, the industries in America and Britain had a grand year,
Mm,
where
okay.
they sold many more books. People stayed home during the pandemic, and they bought books en masse, and they continued to read. In India, though, the publishers were in some strife, during the pandemic, and many of them I think in 2020 at least stopped acquiring books, new books for a while because they did not know how the industry was going or in that sense. So I think, you see, in India, there are a couple of issues. One issue is that I think that the reading habit is not developed at a young age,
Very,
in India,
very
unlike
true.
it is in the West. It is developed by parents or by schools
Absolutely.
or the plethora of libraries and public libraries you have over there, and at a very young age, in the West, and it continues after that, not just the West, even in Japan and Korea and
Yeah.
these particular countries. So that way, in India, on the other hand, in large sections of society, reading is considered is tantamount to getting an education.
Yeah.
People read for
Like,
exams,
correct.
people
Only
read
the
for
academic
to
books
get
are given
yeah,
prioritized.
yeah,
Priority.
to get into a career or all that, but not that much, for pleasure. So if reading is going to take off, that will have to change. I don't know how to do that, but that thing will have to change. Also, I think that I certainly know about the West, the literary culture is huge, in that sense. I mean, how it happens. There are in India now they have lit fests, but and quite a few of them, but it's not like every library is having some sort of
Yes.
program, every day where kids are being brought in and where everything is happening. And then I am lucky that I am teaching at one of the universities where creative writing is taught, so I teach in that. But in most Indian universities, creative writing to this day is not taught. you
Yes.
know
Yes.
while it all over the world it's taught now. I think if that happens, then I think the literary culture might actually pick up, because a lot of people would get into creative writing. There would be an industry around it. There would be an academic discourse, around it,
Very true.
and it would happen. But in India, still it is an outlier. So I think in India, I think it will take a lot of take a lot of time. And then specifically the kinds of books I write, stuff like literary fiction, I think for that you need it's a little different from writing, like commercial thriller or something like that.
Correct.
So for that you probably need a little bit more discerning reader,
True.
for that
Very true.
kind of stuff. So I think it will take time, but I'm hoping that things will get better as we
Yes.
go on.
Yes. That is actually one of our like key, what I call like the driving force behind Writers Melon. Like the whole vision behind Writers Melon is we want to increase the number of readers, because it seems that a lot of people want to write, but it's very
Yeah.
hard to get people who are like really into reading, and getting a lot of people who read at least 10 books a year, or let's say 15 books a year.
No,
So
that's the sad part, because you can't be a good writer without being a good reader. So if you want to write, you should be reading, quite regularly. So
yes,
that is, that's, but one should remain optimistic.
yes,
And
true, true.
I think that as the country gets more sophisticated, better educated, all that thing, then I think people will want books, because see, books deliver something that no other media can deliver.
Correct.
In that sense, you were talking about, like, let's talk about fiction for a moment, in that. I mean, you were talking about history, and you were talking about, the role fiction maybe plays in teaching people
Retelling,
about
yeah,
history.
retelling the history, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So like I'll give from my example. I've to this day I haven't been tempted into picking up a book about a non-fiction book about the American Civil War. You know, I mean, or a biography or a historical book.
Very
But
true.
I've read a few novels about the American Civil War, and the one I'm reading right now, which is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, which is about slavery, so which is a connected issue to the American Civil War. Now, I would never read about black slavery in the southern part of the United States in a non-fiction book, I wouldn't be interested. But yeah, because I'm reading about it in a novel, I'm learning stuff, that I wouldn't have
Exactly.
learned.
Exactly.
Having fun in the process.
Very true. I think that's a very good point, because a lot of us read history just for exams and to pass the exams,
Yeah.
and probably just cram up the dates. Don't even know why
Mm,
those dates are so important. Whereas what is important is the learning and what the people went through during that time. And we
mm,
often we are not taught that when we are studying history. We don't really learn about the impact or the learnings from those events for future.
mm,
We are often just
mm,
thrown with facts which are most of the times very boring and repetitive
mm.
and do not have any connection with each other. So that I
Yeah,
think is
that's
a very good attempt, and I'm often very drawn to historical fiction, and I love to read historical fiction just because of this reason, that it helps me get a good world view, like expand your world view about things, when
mm,
you read history.
mm.
And now at this stage I feel I have missed on so much of historical, like history as a subject. I missed on so much information and so much of learning when I was reading history, although I got very good marks, but it is nowhere related to the knowledge or the wisdom you could probably get out
Yeah,
of reading it.
yeah. A novel will put faces on history,
Exactly, exactly.
makes it more attractive, to
Very
go
true.
in to go into it. And as you were saying, whichever way you do it is important to know history, because we tend
Very
to repeat history, and
exactly.
we tend to repeat bad history, rather
Yes,
than the good
yes,
history.
yes.
It's as a people, as a nation. You know.
I had so much fun talking to you about history. I think I'm going to again reach out to you and do one more like a discussion, and I'll put some topic around history and we can talk about it. I think it is really fun
Sure.
doing it with people like you
Yeah.
who are like so much into research and writing about it, and also a professor. So
Yeah.
let me end this interview with your book recommendations. What are you reading, and what would you recommend our readers, our viewers today, as let's say 4 or 5 books that come to your mind that you would love to
Okay.
recommend them?
And can I also give a little piece of advice to writers?
Yes,
While
yes, please.
okay, yeah, books this year. I'm only going to talk about this year.
Yeah,
I'm reading The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead.
that's it. Yeah.
The best novel I read this year is a novel called The Promise by Damon Galgut, which won the Booker Prize.
Mm.
Uh, won the Booker Prize this year. And then I also read The Fisherman. It's by an African author, Nigerian author. I'm not able to remember the name. And earlier in the year, I reread The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. You
Okay.
know,
Okay.
so those I think are the four standout books that. Oh yeah, and also my brilliant friend, the Elena Ferrante book, the first book of that of the Naples trilogy, that she wrote. So those would be the 5 books that I would recommend.
Good.
Now,
And your
a little
advice.
bit,
Yeah.
yeah, a little bit, I want to say, see, it's only in 2018 when I was in Vermont that I first became aware of how important it is to have a good editor, in that. I'm not talking of an editor with somebody at a company, at a publisher with whom you sign a contract, but a good personal editor to look at your work. And I wish it hadn't taken so late, but everybody there had a personal editor whom they trusted. And when they wrote something, they would send them out to them, get their viewpoint, and then go back and rewrite it. Because you see, the editor, certainly a good editor, their role is to make your work better, you
Correct.
know, sense.
And they understand the trade very good, right? Because yesterday I
Yeah,
was talking to a new author who wants to get published, and I was like, first thing is get an editor, and even if you go
yeah,
through like 2, 3 drafts, like go
yeah,
for it with a good editor, because they really understand the business of books. They really understand
mm,
how and where your book can be positioned, how to
mm,
present it. Like first views they will give is there are too many eyes, the first person, second person, what works, what doesn't work. They really know they really know these things, you know.
Yeah, and
So,
also, writers write, you are taken up with your own work. Now,
yeah,
if want to get it published, you're not writing for yourself, you're writing for others.
yeah,
Not writing a diary that you write for yourself. You're trying to write a published book. So, I mean, there are many things that someone else with trained eyes can see that you can't see yourself. It's absolutely impossible. So since 2019, I have been working with an editor and I've seen how the work has improved. Like it's been the short stories I've published. I've published about 7 since October 2020, shorter pieces. And all of them I sent to this editor and I saw them grow and improve, in after I got her feedback. So I would suggest this to everybody that, it's well worth it. It's well worth the expense. It's well worth the time, what it does it. And if you seriously want to be a good writer, and I'm saying good in a way that good and successful hopefully go together, in that sense. If you want to be a good writer or maybe the best writer you can possibly be, then I would suggest that you get a good editor, someone whom you can trust, build a relationship, a long-term working relationship with, and work with that person before you even think of publishing the piece or the book.
very well said. Yes, absolutely, absolutely agree. So thank you so much, Vikram, for all your time and valuable feedback and such an interesting conversation around history and your books. I wish you all the best. Have a great year ahead. And yeah, enjoy Christmas.
Okay, well, look forward to talking to you again
Thank you.
sometime.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.